Welcome to our interview today. We are interviewing Dr. Chris Walzer. Chris Walzer is the Executive Director of Health at the Wildlife Conservation Society and a professor at the University of Veterinary Medicine in Vienna, Austria. Today, we will be talking about the wildlife trade and the COVID-19 pandemic. This interview is part of a larger series organized by the Animal Issues Thematic Cluster of the United Nations NGO Major Group in connection with this year's annual high-level political forum. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Hi.
So my first question is a very broad one. How is the COVID-19 pandemic linked to the wildlife trade?
Yeah, it's obviously a good but very broad question. So the one side of the story is, of course, that the ancestral host of the SARS coronavirus 2 is found in a horseshoe bat species. So it's clearly a zoonotic disease that has spilled over from a wildlife host in some form or other into humans. And at this point in time, of course, it's a human-to-human transmission that is driving the pandemic, but at its origin, it had the zoonotic mechanism that drove the spillover. So what is unclear is how the spillover happened, where it precisely happened, and what mechanisms drove this spillover. But the initial cases and how the world heard about the spillover event were related to a wildlife trading market in Wuhan, China. It's this so-called, it's a seafood, mostly seafood trading wet market. Also sells, produce and other things and has an impact. But there is a western part of the market where wildlife was traded. And in the original case description, you actually had to have a link to that market for it to be classified as a COVID-19 disease. So that created some kind of bias. And as the studies came out in the first few months, it was seen that not every case was related or linked to the market. So there's a lot of unknowns about this origin. But one thing that is clear, just based on the fact that it's a coronavirus and the way the two other zoonotic coronaviruses have moved into humans, they've used intermediary hosts in wildlife or domestic camels for the case of MERS. So there's a high probability that this virus used a very similar mechanism. And the wildlife trade just does provide the perfect opportunities for new viruses to recombine and then in the end spill over to humans. So we need to keep our eye on this market. And as you know, today actually the WHO has announced a fact-finding mission to look precisely at the spillover mechanisms and go back and look at the data that's available from the market.
Now, broadly speaking, beyond just the COVID pandemic, is the wildlife trade the main pathway by which zoonotic diseases are transmitted to humans?
Well, it's a difficult question to quantify. What's really important to understand that more than half of all infectious diseases of humans have their origin in animals. And of the emerging ones, those are the ones that we're particularly interested in. The emerging infectious diseases, 3/4 of them actually have their origin in wildlife. That means the reservoir is in wildlife. And the easiest way for us to come into contact with wildlife is when we trade them and bring humans and wildlife in close proximity to each other. There are obviously other ways of spillover. You can spill over on a logging road somewhere in Africa by buying an animal or consuming an animal. But the wildlife trade per se, and especially the commercial wildlife trade on the scale as we see it in Southeast Asia and in China is just such a super interface that allows viruses to spill over. So that's why there's so much attention on these markets, because of the sheer number of species and the fact that they are alive. And the advantage of being alive, disadvantage for us, advantage for viruses is these animals are able to shed viruses And at the same time, two viruses can infect the same cell, and then you can get recombination events, which will create a new virus. Because remember, it is actually quite difficult for viruses to switch species and acquire the traits that are necessary to subsequently transmit within that new species, for example, in humans. It doesn't happen that often. It's a numbers game. You need to provide opportunities for this to happen.
Mm-hmm. Is the risk primarily from illegal wildlife trade, or are legal forms of wildlife trade, whether that's domestic trading that isn't regulated by CITES, wildlife farming, are they also zoonotic risks?
Absolutely. So it makes, from a virus point of view, or a spillover point of view, it makes absolutely no difference if the animal is legal or illegal, sustainable or unsustainable. It makes no difference, really. There's, on the wildlife side of things, there's just very little knowledge about the pathogens that are circulating in these wildlife. And if they're being farmed, actually, there could be a heightened risk because there's just the sheer number of them being, and often they're also genetically depauperate, so it's easier for viruses to evolve within these populations. The classic examples would be, populations of porcupines, which if we assume that it would be a closed breeding population, they would genetically be depauperate after several generations, and it will be easier for a virus to mutate therein. But honestly, there's not much research going on, but we know from domestic side of things that if you have large pools of animals, that constitutes really a heightened risk.
I would assume that applies to domestic animals as well as wild ones. How much of a zoonotic risk is livestock farming?
Well, all the classic and some of the best known zoonotic diseases we've acquired them from domestic livestock. The whole phase of domestication of livestock was a phase in human evolution where we acquired many zoonotic diseases. Some of the classic ones are measles, for example. Now it's a uniquely human disease. This is a disease that we acquired during the domestication process. As you've seen with some of the influenza viruses, of course, there are opportunities to evolve and develop traits within pig populations or poultry populations are well documented. So there's a really strong risk there as well, of course.
What about habitat destruction? I know that is also marked sometimes as a driver of potential wildlife-derived zoonotic diseases. Could you explain if that's the case? And if so, why habitat destruction increases zoonotic transmission?
Yeah, so basically what we're always talking about are so-called interfaces where humans and wildlife have contact. So let's just imagine you have a pristine forest and you put a logging road through it. So you see the logging road going through your forest. And basically one way of looking at it, it's a road, it goes from A to B. But if you look at the edge right and left of the road, you have this long contact between wildlife, which is in the forest, and humans, which are moving along the road, sometimes with their livestock or just humans. And basically what's happening is viruses circulating inside the forest within various wildlife species, and the road provides the opportunity for this virus to spill over into humans and or the livestock. And beyond that, of course, it also provides the opportunity for the subsequent virus or pathogen then to travel along that road to larger urban centers where it can subsequently spread to human. So it's all about the interfaces and this opportunity, what we call sort of the edges of destruction. Those are the really risky places where viruses can cross over from wildlife into humans.
In what ways have governments addressed the role of the wildlife trade and other practices like deforestation harmful to wildlife in their coronavirus response policies and measures?
So there's quite a gradient in the responses. I think the most forceful response has been the response from the Chinese administration and government from the highest levels that had very, very quickly first temporarily banned the the use of any form of wildlife, be it legal, illegal, or anything else, for human consumption. And that temporary ban is then moving on to a permanent ban. And at the moment, the Chinese government and administrations are working through legislation, developing the new legislation so that they can enshrine these bans in a permanent fashion. So that's a really strong position, and actually should serve as a model for many other countries, because China does have a lot of wildlife farming, and that's why them taking such a dramatic and strong position is particularly important, and we do commend them for that. Then the government of Vietnam, of course, is also investigating how to ban wildlife consumption and developing legislation and so on. And we assume that there will be a spill-on effect as the next countries, every country will develop legislation, and the neighboring countries will be forced to react as well, because you don't want to have legislation in your country, but your neighbor is practicing something you've tried to ban. So that's one side. And then, of course, there's a completely different situation in areas where the provision of wildlife and access to wildlife is a food security issue, which is quite different than the situation in Southeast Asia, generally speaking.
Could you talk a little bit more about that last point? Because there have been a lot of concerns about bans on the wildlife trade potentially harming people who are dependent on them, either for subsistence or for their livelihood. What kinds of measures can be taken to mitigate that problem?
Okay, so this is a really central theme. So one of the things is, first of all, to be clear-eyed and to recognize what we're talking about. We're talking about commercial, often international trade in wildlife for consumption for the new and wealthy middle class. This is a luxury item. Sometimes it's a status symbol. To eat a pangolin is very expensive. It's a status symbol. It's illegal. It's something sort of, I would say, a perverse way of boasting that you can afford to do this. It does not fulfill any food security or any food or nutritional needs. So throughout all these large commercial markets, this is really providing food for people who are not food insecure, or it's just a preference. They like to eat it, it's expensive, that's one reason. And that starkly contrasts to communities, indigenous peoples and local communities, which are absolutely dependent on wildlife to meet their nutritional needs. And these large markets are actually sucking out the wildlife from these forests and actually harming and reducing the access and availability of wildlife to the people who are desperately or necessarily dependent on wildlife. So actually, by targeting the large commercial trade for richer people outside their needs, beyond their needs, we're actually protecting indigenous peoples and local communities. And actually, it is surprising how this argument is being put to the forefront without a clear understanding of the interconnectedness of the problem. And it's actually, in my opinion, often being used as a front to not actually address the problem. And by pushing that forwards and saying we need to protect indigenous peoples and local communities, we're trying to, it appears that one tries to stop the argument of what's actually going on. So this is a front as far as I'm concerned, and it's something we need to be very cautious of, to not let many of the organizations, big organizations, would like to continue as it has been, just business as usual. And this is being used as far as I'm concerned, as a front. No one has ever stated or in any way negated the needs or the rights of indigenous people and local communities that are dependent on wildlife. That is a given. That's what we start with. It's about the trade, which is built up on top of that, which is creating economic opportunities for traders and business, and provisioning people who do not depend on this wildlife at all.
It's really interesting that the argument is being used in kind of an insincere or a misguided way to kind of oppose any kind of top-down action against the trade. In terms of addressing the problem from the bottom up, is there any role for like providing alternative livelihoods, alternative livelihood training, transitions to different food systems for communities that are currently dependent on wildlife, bushmeat, either for subsistence or for trade?
Absolutely. So there are certain different pillars you need to approach it on. First of all, the communities that are dependent on and not only have a need, but also a right to use wildlife within their communities, need to provide at least some sort of basic education to say, you know, just at the level, when you butcher animals, this is the moment when you're at greatest risk. Be aware of what the potential outcomes can be to your community, to your families, and so on. And that's ongoing throughout many parts of Africa and in Latin America. The problems are well known, and this is, I think, quite consistent everywhere. As we move away from, so to say, the purely indigenous people, local communities, and we start moving into that urban gradient, this is the area where we definitely need to provide alternatives. And that there's a lot of work being done to provide alternatives, which are, first of all, meet the needs and rights, but also are viable and sustainable. That's not so easy. But there have been, for example, there have been huge progresses in chicken production just by the availability of new thermostable vaccines for Newcastle disease. So chickens, which in the past were practically impossible to raise in Africa, in a backyard chicken, production system can now be raised, and a whole business cascade can be built around this using invertebrates to feed the chicks. Then someone sells the chicks to the end user. Then you have it in the backyard. You have meat and eggs and so on. So things are moving, but it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of effort. And so the focus needs to be, there's a lot of things that need to be done all the time, everywhere. So the most expedient way is to address it, I think, at this point in time, to stop the demand and this market, which is pulling out the wildlife and which is causing the greatest risk at the moment. The threat is always there, but the risk is by creating these interfaces. So that's why I think we need to focus there very, very clearly and not always go back and say, yes, but what you're saying is going to harm someone way down the gradient. At the end of the proverbial road I was talking about, that's not the issue. The issue is 8 million people living in a city and 30% of them eating wildlife on a regular basis. That's a problem.
Since you have also talked about the zoonotic risk from livestock farming, is there a risk of actually worsening the zoonotic risk by transitioning people from living off of wildlife to something like chicken farming? And if so, is that an argument for focusing more on like plant-based food systems?
Well, these are good questions, of course, and they're more complex than I'm going to be able to answer in a few sentences here. So on a global scale, a certain movement and a certain percentage and movement away from meat-based diets is going to be essential. We already know the global impacts of meat production. It's just measured from its protein content. It's not a viable option. It's very resource wasting. So a reduction in meat-based diets, of course, is difficult. But who are we? Who am I, or who are we to tell people in Africa if they shouldn't eat meat? That's just not appropriate in any way and makes no sense. But what we can do, of course, is, as you say, provide alternatives. And the chicken production we're talking about is really backyard chicken production, not industrial scale. This should be decentralized backyard chicken production that communities can make and provide for their own communities. The moment you start shifting into larger urban centers, that's not going to work anymore anyway, because then you do suddenly see the increase in this industrial type of production of chickens. And then we'll get to the point you were talking about. This increases the zoonotic risk significantly, of course.
Has it hurt efforts to highlight the role of the wildlife trade in the COVID-19 pandemic, or I suppose demotivated action, that there have been so much misinformation, conspiracy theories revolving around COVID having a different origin than the animal trade? Has that been harmful to actions to combat it?
It's also a good and very interesting question. So one of the things that is quite extraordinary, of course, is the politicization of this whole theme. We have a global pandemic, which has killed, I haven't looked this morning, but more than 500,000 people. There's some 12 to 13 million cases now. And in part, the problem has been hijacked by politics and by businesses. By business interests are pushed to the forefront. Economic recovery seems to be the most important thing. And that has detracted a lot from addressing the root causes, of course. It has removed science often from decision-making process. There's no question about that. And I think this is something where we need to advocate for science-based decision process. We need to get over this politicization and haggling about the coercion. You know, we know that 75% of all emerging infectious disease have their origin in wildlife. This has been, we've studied this, we know it. It's always interesting to do more. But we've reached this point in time now that we actually need to act. And acting is just going to be uncomfortable. We're going to have to make some decisions which not everyone and every business operation is going to be comfortable with. So as far as I'm concerned, it has detracted on the one hand, but it has also made it very, very clear that these are some opportunities we can address. For the first time, each and every person on this planet is impacted by something which has come from wildlife, and there is a clear understanding that our interactions with wildlife have caused this in some way or other. And even if they ever manage to trace the origin and the exact spillover mechanism, it doesn't change anything at the basic story. It's a wildlife origin virus that has somehow managed to get across to humans. And that is driven by the way we interact and what this interface is. So I think it has provided a great opportunity. We just need to seize it. And we need to seize it, and we need to move on to think of a post-COVID recovery, but not only in terms of economic recovery. We need to think about what is our economy going to look like in the future, and what price are we going to pay? This idea that nature is cheap is being undermined, not only by the COVID pandemic, but it's also being undermined by climate change. It's quite comfortable these 6 months. We haven't had too much discussion about climate change, but that's just around the corner. And that is the same process. This makes nature a lot more expensive. So we cannot discount it as we have.
Do you think that the response, or in some cases, the insufficient response to the pandemic, offers any lessons for how to address the problem of climate change going forward, especially as it becomes worse in coming decades?
It certainly raises concern. And it's interesting, you know, in what was it, 2017, 2018? No, sorry, 2019, I think there was an exercise in the United States where they did a sort of a war game and said we're going to have a virus come and hit us. I think it was in Chicago. It was quite similar to what COVID-19 and its properties. And then following that exercise was determined that the country was not ready for next infectious disease outbreak, but it had no consequences. And I think we're seeing the same in climate change. We know it's coming. We see it. The water is rising depending where you're living. And somehow we think, you know, in our typical human discounting the future, we sort of think we're going to get through this. So, we need to, obviously at the moment, we need to address this ongoing pandemic and the devastation it's causing just on a daily scale, but we need to be very, very clear just behind that. We need to address climate change. And so maybe learning lessons from one to the other and saying we cannot keep discounting the future, we cannot discount the environment is going to be an important lesson. We're be hopeful at least.
Will climate change in any way aggravate the risk of zoonotic diseases and future pandemics?
So climate change, of course, is a driver that changes the environment, changes host composition, changes these edges of destruction. It's particularly a strong driver when it's when invertebrates, for example, mosquitoes, are intermediary hosts or vectors. Then you see the climate changes very, very quickly. The most clear one is the northward movement of many former tropical diseases, which are migrating into the Mediterranean, but also here in the United States, coming into Texas, Arizona, and so on. So yes, climate change is obviously an important driver, and we will be dealing with especially vector-borne diseases and climate change effects. We are already, it's paled at the moment with COVID-19, but it's ongoing. Zika is a good example, by the way. So yes, that's for sure. It's going to be there all the time.
Backtracking a little bit, you identified the butchering of animals as being the single riskiest part of the process in terms of transmitting diseases. But at other stages in which the animals are alive, capture, live transport, or in settings like farming in an industrial agricultural setting, what kinds of factors in the treatment of the animals while they're alive impact the disease risk, and what role can animal welfare standards play in mitigating that?
Yeah, so so the problem with the whole, and we've shown this quite conclusively recently, how there's a clear increase in positivity to coronavirus, for example, along the food value chain. So as you move from the capture site in a field to the trader, to the marketplace, and then from the market to the restaurant. As you move along that chain, positivity increases. And we've shown this for coronaviruses, but we can assume this works for other viruses as well. This just happened to be a coronavirus study. But, and this happens because there's more and more contact between more and more animals from different places. And as you point out, they're alive, so they're able to exchange fecal matter, urine, saliva, and so on. And that provides opportunities to exchange viruses. Now, the other side of the equation, one is the pathogen side, the virus, but the other one is the host immune system and the host immunity. Now, if you have to imagine these wildlife are being captured, so that's a stressful event. Then you're sticking them into a box. You're transporting them somewhere. You're putting them next to other wildlife, which may come from a completely different part of the world. So they're next to animals they should never meet in wildlife, in the real world. All these things are extraordinarily stressful. Then the absolute treatment and the complete disregard for the life of these animals. There's no regard for the type of how to slaughter them humanely and all these things. It doesn't exist really in these markets. So you have this extraordinary, as I always say, it's this cauldron of contagion. On the one side, you have the pathogens, which are sort of brewing and exchanging. But on the other side, you're doing absolutely everything to also weaken the immune response and the immune system of these animals by stressing them out maximally. You know, you provide inadequate food, inadequate housing. All these factors compile with the pathogens to create the best possibilities to create new viruses and spillover events. So animal welfare is not going to be the solution, because the solution is really to ban this kind of use of wildlife in this kind of format. But of course, if you had an increased and better wildlife, better welfare, excuse me, then there would be less stress for the animals, and it would be humane slaughter and so on. It would probably reduce the amount of viruses that it's spewing into the environment. But unfortunately, I think we have to be careful to not address it from a wildlife issue, because there's only so much you can do. You have wildlife, the welfare is always going to be massively compromised, even if you treat them as well as you can. But definitely, once you stack them on top of each other, you know, even if it's the nicest cage, it's not going to help.
I'm sorry, there's a lot of sound pollution on my end. But before we end, are there any other points regarding the connection between the wildlife trade or consumption of animals more broadly and pandemics that you would like to highlight?
Well, I think the most important, well, not the most important, but one factor is also we don't always have to go all the way to the pandemic. It's already small epidemics which are problematic. So we do need to see them on a global scale, but we also need to look at wildlife trade on a local scale. And this is also something we mustn't disregard, as the world has really, really changed. One of the reasons why SARS coronavirus 2, in contrast to the first SARS outbreak in 2002, 2003, was able to spread so quickly is also the clear interconnectedness and tight interconnectedness of the global community now. So a virus can just move very, very quickly across the globe. So we need to be very aware that things that we could accept and conditions that we could accept 20 years ago, possibly, because it seemed so remote, there's no way it's going to get to one of the big urban centers, has changed. And so we need to adapt our responses to these new conditions, you know, of the interconnectedness, the amount of movement of goods and people around the globe. I think that's something that's also got lost a little bit in the transaction, in the discussions these past few months.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your time, Chris. It's been fascinating and very much appreciate your perspective. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Have a nice afternoon. Bye-bye.